Hello, and welcome to the Logistics Management Podcast Series. My name's Jeff Berman. I'm Group News Editor for Logistics Management Magazine and also the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome John McCown to our podcast. John is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Marine Strategy, the Navy League's think tank. John is a recognized expert in container shipping with 4 decades of senior operating and investment experience in the sector, including CEO of a container shipping carrier and managing transport investments at a $20 billion hedge fund. John now advises, lectures, and writes about maritime issues, and his analyses and observations are widely read and quoted. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and also holds 2 patents, one related to container cargo handling and another related to vessel propulsion. John worked closely with transportation pioneer Malcom McLean, the inventor of container shipping, for 20 years. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jeff. Very pleased to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely a pleasure to have you. We'll just dig right in, John. Obviously, we'll be sticking with the theme of ocean container shipping and just looking at the current state of the market, John. How would you sort of assess where things stand? And obviously, we'll drill down on this in a few different ways, but on kind of like a more general level to get the ball rolling here.
Well, Jeff, probably more uncertain in terms of the balance of this year than any time I can recall. But that uncertainty, of course, is driven by tariffs and what their level and timing will be. There was a time when many folks thought or hoped that their tariffs wouldn't be particularly severe, but the events of the last few months seem to make it clear that we're going to have meaningful tariffs. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that I or anybody who spent their career in container shipping don't like tariffs. But with that clear bias, it's kind of backed up by, I think, the facts that tariffs really make little economic sense for anyone. But that's the overriding factor that everybody should be looking at. So these tariffs are going to be a big driver on the container shipping market and what happens with volumes, most particularly in the U.S. lanes. That inevitably will impact relates. Kind of another factor that is a little ways off, but I don't think is getting the attention that it deserves, and it's really a different form of tariffs, is the USTR planned fees on ships that call in the U.S.
Yes.
That are built or operated by the Chinese. So that's something to kind of keep your eye on also. But all of those are going to be the driver for the rest of this year.
Yeah, no question about it. And obviously, tariffs, as you had just talked about a second ago, they've been in the news in a big way this week. We saw the July 9th reciprocal pause date. Actually, today's July 9th, so it's gotten pushed back to early next month. We have the expiration of the 3 month China pause coming up. I believe it's on August 12th, I want to say. Um, and it leads to a whole bunch of uncertainty. It's hard to plan, it's hard to invest, it's hard to hire when you don't know what the set tariff rates are going to be. And you had just done a good job of laying things out, John. I'd like to get your take on sort of this week's developments and how and in what potential ways it could impact the things that we pay close attention to, whether it's volumes, freight flows, service lines, blank sailings, the whole deal. I know there's a lot there in that question, but I'd like to hear how you think the uncertainty driven by tariffs impacts those types of things.
Well, Jeff, you really hit the nail on the head in terms of that uncertainty, and with that kind of this on again, off again kind of erratic nature, and to my way of thinking, it's really that on again, off again that makes what's a bad idea an even worse idea. And as you know, and all the shippers in the audience know, supply chains are months, if not years, in the making, and everybody that's involved in putting them together study and make sure that they have everything, and when they pull the trigger, they're looking for regularity and kind of a constant rhythm. That rhythm is often best expressed on a weekly basis. And what's happening now and has kind of been happening really since there was some uncertainty in terms of what would be done. The April 9th decisions made clear that there were going to be some potential big actions. Then we got into kind of this a bizarre phase of tariffs going up to 145% for China and then coming back. And all of that on again, off again, unfortunately, is just throwing a sledgehammer at that regularity that is so important to shippers. And so that really kind of plays havoc with the system. And in some ways, that's as bad as the tariffs are. If they were known, people could and would adapt to them, and you'd have
Sure.
another kind of regularity. We don't have that now. And so you have a situation, we're already starting to see kind of the first impact of the tariffs that went in. And, there was an immediate stoppage of a lot of shipments, 145%. And then when it went to 30%, there was kind of a mini surge. And all of those are just stressing systems that work best with that regularity. So that, in many ways, is kind of the an even worse impact of these tariffs. That on again, off again, and that uncertainty. Again, the freight movements of all companies are obviously a very key part of their business, and it relies on knowing pretty precisely when your freight's going to arrive. There was a time where container shipping was so precise you could set your watch by when a load would arrive in a port and when it would get to your DC. Within a couple hours. When the system starts to back up and get into gridlock, and the worst case, of course, was during the pandemic, you didn't even know what week or some cases what month. And that just throws incredible cost and uncertainty and chaos and that just messes up everything for everybody. So
No,
so it's that uncertainty that is more than anything that is really bad.
no, it's hard to argue that. Let's shift gears over to pricing, John. What can shippers really do to ensure they're doing well on rates and pricing? And I know this comes at a time when we're seeing declines in a lot of pricing at the moment. And then also, just as a follow-up, John, how much faith or stock should stakeholders be putting into the rate exchanges, if you will? They are definitely relied on a lot, but are they always bringing what the stakeholders need, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask. So those are my two questions on ocean pricing.
Well, first on actual pricing, rates have generally been in a downtrend throughout this year. But recently there was a little bit of an uptick in the so-called spot rates, and I'll get to those in a bit. But
Yeah.
and that was really kind of largely driven by the effect of that kind of shocking but short-lived 145% China tariffs that stopped a lot of things. And then when they were relaxed with the temporary 30%, some of those started rolling. And that caused that kind of bunching up. And so, it wasn't really any increased volume, but it was kind of bunched together in a shorter period. So that led to the spike. And in general, we're still getting about 40% of our inbound boxes come from China. So what happens in that market is really kind of a driver. But as it relates to rates, I couldn't stress more that shippers should focus on all of the factual pricing mechanism they can find, but most importantly, they should focus on the aggregate pricing. I have the spot indices have some major credibility issues with them. They're very different than spot indices in, say, the dry bulk sector, where the BDI represents real pricing and actual, and it's the pricing of everything. Remember
Yes.
that in container shipping, spot indexes came up with the way of the carriers to deal with intermediaries. they didn't want to find themselves in a situation where they were giving a fixed rate to an intermediary who would then, based on the market changing, use that against them. And so in the U.S. trade lanes, I don't think there's really more than about 15 or 20% of the actual loads move on spot rates. But they've been really kind of misused. The credibility is such, if you look at a graph, and in my normal reports, monthly reports, I always kind of show a graph of the CTS Global Pricing Index over quite a few years versus the SCFI, which is certainly the most popular spot index. And when you look at those two graphs, you become clearly aware that the spot indices, even though people say, well, that's the market at this point in time, it's a sliver of the market. You can see very readily that contract rates do not reset at spot rates. And so the credibility of those rates are really concerning. And they're all really kind of surveys. When I was at a hedge fund, my first trip to Shanghai, I spent the afternoon with the folks at the Shanghai Shipping Index and became aware that it's really little more than a phone call to 20 intermediaries on what they believe the rate would be. And that belief,
Hmm.
what they heard at lunch or what they thought, but
Yeah.
it doesn't represent a real rate. So I'd be very, very, there's information content, but if you want the actual pricing, look at what the global pricing index of the CTS, Container Trade Statistics, because that's not a survey. Container Trade Statistics gets their data from all of the carriers. It's the universe. And they also have monthly pricing indices they sell by, dozens of trade lanes. If I was a shipper and had freight moving in a given trade lane, I'd pay the modest amount to get that pricing index because that tells you on a monthly basis what is actually occurring. So you need to be very skeptical of container. I wouldn't. I'm sure every good container salesman, when he's negotiating a rate, puts in front the spot indices that is most favorable. And but one needs to look at that with a large grain of sand and kind
Hmm.
of be focused on the aggregate pricing in that market because I can assure you, major shippers and most contract shippers do not reset their contracts at the then current spot rate. So you're being so yeah, it's I'm not going to say misleading. It is what it is. They disclose where the pricing comes from, but it's they're not they are most definitely not the measure of what pricing is in the industry at that given point in time. You need to look at the aggregate measures for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points there. Um, and moving over to service, John, how would you sort of view the current state of ocean service now compared to a year ago at this time?
Well, we're kind of moving in completely different directions versus a year ago, both in terms of rate and volume. A year ago, and we were kind of almost at the peak a year ago in terms of rates, and I peak in terms of carriers, I mean, good for carriers. And volume was also really strong. And the rate issue was as many people know, but was driven entirely or mostly by the situation in the Red Sea. The Red Sea, the Asia to Europe trade lane, is one of the largest. Represents 25% of worldwide container miles. And with the Houthis shooting in the Red Sea, all of the container ships basically were going the long way around Africa. And that was a voyage that was one third more. So you go through the math, and 25% of the worldwide container miles, if you have a third more, that literally had the impact of taking 8% of capacity out of the worldwide market. And even though it really directly only impacted that market, everything is kind of tied in together. And certainly the other big east-west lane Asia to North America, another 25%. So as capacity was kind of pulled out of one market to kind of help the other market, it just has kind of a water level effect. And so everybody ended up paying more. About a year ago, we were right at the peak of that. On top of
Hmm.
that, last year was a pretty good volume situation. Both the U.S. was outperforming the world, but the U.S. volume, inbound volume last year, for all of last year, was up 15%. Worldwide volume was up 6%. You contrast that with today. We saw for the first time the tangible impact of the tariffs in the May inbound volume
Hmm.
figures. And my report shows we were down 7% May versus year ago May. And that's versus year to date we've been up 6%. So we're starting to see that tangible effect. So I guess compared to last year, we're going both down in pricing and down in volume. And unfortunately, this is really just the beginning, in my view, of the declines we're going to see in volume. Now, in terms of what that turns into service, that's different. If you just were to say you'd have the same capacity, say in the U.S. market, and volume's going to go down, that would generally mean more pressure on rates. Presumably, service would be more consistent and kind of good for shippers. The unknown, though, is the activity in terms of the carriers, in terms of blanking their sailings. That's a new tool that they're using and using quite aggressively to kind of match capacity with volume. And then the real big unknown to me from a rate standpoint and kind of from a shipping service standpoint in the U.S. lane is really this USTR ship fees, and that's been watered down and pushed off until October. But it's still pretty pernicious in terms of the rather extraordinary fees on ships operated by Chinese carriers or
Yeah.
ships built in China. And that's where there could be some really adverse capacity effects. I mean, for instance, even though it's only the fourth biggest carrier in the world, Costco, the big Chinese carrier, is the largest carrier in terms of volume in the Asia to West Coast lane. I think it's something in the order of 12 or 13%. The fees they will have to pay will make those ships quickly non-competitive, I believe. You're talking millions per voyage. So reason would say those would be pulled out. Perhaps their alliance partners, I think CMA, CGM, and Yang Ming could find capacity that would not be Chinese built to augment that. But then on top of that, you have quite a few Chinese built ships, I think particularly with CMA, CGM. So that offers the possibility of pulling a significant amount of capacity out of the U.S. market, which will have a countervailing, impact on rates. And so you're getting into a situation where there are so many moving pieces. And when you have all of these moving pieces, we also know there are unintended consequences that come out of that. So it's going to be a rocky rest of this year, but a rocky with a downward focus on volume. In general, that would lead to a little more rate relief, but then the USTR thing really kind of throws a monkey wrench into it.
No, for sure. That's well said. Thank you for that. Um, John, you and I had recently spoken a couple of weeks back about some new bipartisan legislation that was recently introduced in the House, entitled the Federal Maritime Commission Reauthorization Act of 2025. I was just wondering what your initial thoughts are on this piece of legislation. Does it have a chance of passing? And also, what parts of it do you think resonate most with shippers?
Well, it is unusual to, at least from my recollection, to have a separate reauthorization bill, and it's nice to see that it's supported by both parties. Usually, this is kind of a mechanical thing to reauthorize the FMC, and it's usually part of the NDA, National Defense Authorization. That it's a separate bill is a little unusual, but there wasn't really anything. There was a couple of things in there. It spoke of greater, I think, disclosure of their demurrage study that they've done. There was some focus on looking at the very spot indices, and I guess coming to some determination if they're misleading. I'm not quite sure what you do with that information, other than people should be aware of where they get it from. It would seemingly, I guess, kind of that would give the FMC a little more authority to kind of crack down, if you will, on China. And broadly speaking, I don't really like a lot of these anti-creed moves. But I do think it would I don't see any reason that it wouldn't pass. One thing that is we had another the chairman of the FMC resigned recently. I think his term was up. So we only have normally you have five FMC people with the party in power having the majority. Right now, you just have three, and two are Democrats and one's a Republican. But President Trump
Hmm.
has the ability to appoint two more, including the chairman. So I'm sure that will come, and it will perhaps be used. I like the idea that they were talking about continuing to focus on the demurrage audit. I personally think the FMC can and should do more, on what, to my way of looking, were abuses of existing rules during the pandemic on demurrage. Not only on demurrage, but there were situations where carriers kind of ignored their contracts with customers and effectively displaced those with spot business, and that's not appropriate. I think that so I'd really like to see the FMC buckle down on existing things that I think they have the authority to do. Perhaps that's more important than maybe going off on some of these new, looking into situations. Whether the SCFI is a credible index. I'd much prefer the FMC, focus on the existing rules and kind of where there are abuses, and I think there clearly were abuses in during the pandemic. Police those. So that's my
Okay.
view on that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Uh, John, looking at the 2025 peak season, obviously peak season's been a bit different going back to 2020, to be fair, given the pandemic, and all that led to. Um, we've obviously talked a lot today about the on and off again nature of tariff and trade policy activity. Um, and not to steer this back to tariffs when we address peak, but I feel like it can't be helped in some cases. But with that as a backdrop, sort of, John, like how do you assess what's in store for the 2025 peak?
Well, you're right. This is going to certainly be a very different peak season. At the same time, I'm kind of reminded that each of the peak seasons in the last 6 years have been kind of quite different. And again, for all of the
Yes.
reasons that you highlighted on. I think that we're in more typical times we'd be squarely into it right now. But it's going to be very hard. I focus kind of on the actual volume, and it's going to be kind of difficult to kind of parse what's the peak season effect versus what's the tariff effect. And the tariff effect is going to be so overriding. I think when the June numbers come out, they're going to be a little bit more of a decline than May. And then we're going to get, I think, sadly, into double-digit percent reductions. So it's going to be, when you're looking at the numbers, it's going to be hard to see peak. And it's interesting, you have all sorts of anecdotal stories about people talking about front loading, and it's already been, we're not going to have a peak season because shippers have already you know, seen what's happened and they brought in stuff earlier. And I'm
Right.
sure there are cases of that. What's interesting to me, and the numbers are so big in terms of, we bring in something on the order of 120 billion worth of stuff each month in containers. And a lot of people have anecdotally observed that the big increase, the 15% in 2024, well, that's all kind of mostly front end loading. Um, the numbers as it relates to the Census Bureau inventory data simply don't show that. And so it's been kind of flatlining to declining in terms of inventories, and inventory to sales has been kind of at 1.35 to 1, inventory to sales even going down. So I just don't have a sense, at least I like to look at the actual data, and I can't really see in the actual data that there's a lot of giant inventory. And so I guess to the extent that that doesn't exist, you're dealing with a situation where the volume could have some impact. In other words, there's to the extent that people don't have a lot of inventory, problems in the supply chain, could cause problems in terms of the hypothetical having stuff on their shelves. So,
Right.
but yeah, this peak season it seems like we've either already had it, or it's dissipating very very quickly. But it's going to kind of be hard to see in the numbers with all these other major changes going on.
Absolutely. And John, I had something I thought of just now. I thought I'd try to squeeze it in the limited time we have left, and that just has to do with decarbonization and green shipping, if you will, with the International Maritime Organization, more commonly known as IMO, with their targets for reducing carbon emissions and really moving the sector towards low and or zero emission fuels. Yeah, I know there was IMO, there's been different ones, 2023, 2025, 2030, 2050, all with different objectives and goals. And without, we don't have to peel the onion too deep on this, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the IMO's efforts on this in this regard.
Well, I got very involved way back when on the IMO issue in terms of moving away from the dirty sulfur fuel, and I was displeased with the slowness of the IMO situation there. I really think, and it's all well intentioned. I think the real leadership in decarbonization and shipping is obviously being driven by the container sector. They're the carriers that have the interest in doing it, have the economic ability to do it. And so I think that's the leadership. And actually, it's really things like the Maersk and some of the European carriers that are even leaders within that. So one of the big issues with the IMO, other than the container sector, there's not a groundswell of support, in the other sectors, and there the economics are such. The container sector is in the best position to absorb those economics based on the value of the cargo they move, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and the preferences to shippers. I mean, quite frankly, carriers, some quite should be agnostic, and if they have customers, and now you have a very genuine environmental preferences by many of the large shippers because they use it in their own advertisement and it's important to their customers. So you have up and down the chain. So I think the leadership will continue to be within the container sector, within groups within that. There's the World Shipping Council has some extraordinarily talented people that are kind of leading that charge. So I think in many ways they've kind of eclipsed the IMO. The IMO, I know, is in theory the international regulatory body, but I think it's so many disparate sectors within shipping. So I think that container shipping will be leading the way. My own personal view is at some point in the near future, there's going to have to be more serious discussion of some of these small scale, kind of nuclear modular,
Yeah.
molten sulfur plants. If we're serious about moving away from carbon, and because the big issue, the overriding issue, no matter what somebody decides is the right answer, and nobody has really kind of come up with what they say everybody should be moving to. But the bigger tangential issue related to that, if somebody says hypothetically hydrogen or green ammonia, even after you perfect the technology, you need to make sure a ship owner isn't going to embrace that unless he's confident that everywhere his ship goes, he has that infrastructure in place to get the fuel. So it's worth remembering if you go back in history, it was decades after steam-powered ships were known to be highly superior to sail that the
Hmm.
transition occurred. And that transition occurred only because or when the British Navy determined this is the way to go. And the British Navy took a lot of that coal in Newcastle and set up bunkering stations around the world. So one of the great things about nuclear is, if you build it, once it comes out of the shipyard, you're fueled for the life of the ship, or effectively. So you don't have to worry about that. And the other less than minor difference is all these other alternatives effectively eat into the cargo space of the ship. You have to dedicate more space to carrying that fuel. Nuclear is exactly the opposite. So one of the real issues, and why you're going to have massive reluctance within the bulk sector. If you're the first person to switch to a hydrogen or ammonia, even if you're convinced you can get that, you're non-competitive relative to your competition. And there, of course, in those sectors, they're moving much lower valued cargo, and the economics are more adverse. So again, the numbers all kind of come back to pointing to container shipping being at the lead, which I think is good, and I think it's self-motivated. We've learned that the industry moves very slow when it comes to top-down regulations. What's driving the pace of change with the container shipping is that they're on their own timeline, and kind of in many respects well ahead of what some of the regulatory bodies are. So I guess
No.
it's a bit of a long-winded knock that the IMO is not as relevant as they perhaps were in the past.
Right. No, it makes all sense in the world. Well, look, John, this brings us to the end of our allotted time for today's podcast. So, on behalf of Logistics Management Magazine and the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, I'd like to offer up a big thanks for spending some time with us today.
Thank you, Jeff. I was very pleased to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you on LinkedIn, please go ahead and check out John's profile. He's always uh, posting really relevant, interesting, thought-provoking posts and musings, if you will. Just search for John D. McCown. John also has a terrific monthly report. It's called the McCown Report. Uh, also the McCown Container Volume Observer in the subhead I'm seeing. So also another good monthly report replete with tons of great data related to the ocean container sector. And for those of you on Twitter, please feel free to go ahead and give Logistics Management a follow. That's simply at Logistics MGMT. And also, if you aren't already, please go ahead and sign up or subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Just go ahead and punch in Supply Chain 24/7 and it will pop right up. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll catch you next time.